Good morning and welcome to United Churches of Langley live stream service. How wonderful it is to gather with you in this way, to be connected through the ethers, yet connected in a real and profound way. At United Churches of Langley, we are committed to radical inclusion. So however you made your way to this live stream service, wherever you are on your spiritual path, whether filled with faith or racked with doubt. However you identify in gender and sexual orientation, you truly are welcome in this place, gathering together with us to see and to hear and to feel the divine spirit that inspires all of us in all moments and all times. And as we awaken to that, we allow ourselves to be instruments for that spirit in community and in our world. And so we have a special service scheduled for you today. As we gather here today, you will partake of a conversation about imagination. This is one of our live recordings of the podcast ministry. And so I want to give a little bit of background of how we came to this place and what is launching in our midst at this point in time. One of the things that we noticed as we were gathering together a few years ago is there was a population of people that were not finding their way to church. Either they had had trauma or experiences in the world of church that hurt them, that turned them away from the existence of church and sometimes even away from God. And so we've been in conversation with many of those people of all different ages and realized there was a yearning within them to connect in a new way, to find a way to be in conversation about questions about who and what is God, who and what I am. What is this natural world and how is God in or not in that natural world, and what does it mean to be in right relationship with the planet Earth? And so these and many other questions became the catalyst for conversations over the last year and a half through a ministry of United Churches of Langley called Shift. And then what emerged from that is a deeper desire to reach out, to be in that conversation with a larger group of people, because we know everyone is out there. There are people who don't find safe place to have that conversation. And so what we've noticed, and this is even pre-COVID, that although, we keep saying the world is getting smaller, we have all this technology to connect us, there are still many boundaries and borders that separate us from others. That technology can get rid of some of those geographical barriers, but we still want that connection. We still want that way of being in relationship and community with each other. We have a way of being connected to a greater number of people, but that doesn't mean that we're connected. And so we began to explore ways that we might enhance that we might bring the use of technology in a way that actually builds community, deepens connection, and from that birthed the Shift podcast ministry. And so today you'll be able to be a part of the launch of that as we engage with the conversation about imagination with Dr. Richard Topping from Vancouver School of Theology and Brad Jarvis on our Shift podcast team. We allow ourselves to lean into the Spirit, to lean in and to explore for ourselves within our deeper being, what is imagination? What inspires us? How do we open up to a new way of engaging these conversations that might allow for us to set aside some of those doubts, to cultivate a new form of mature faith that is filled with questions, but also filled with answers, with and of the Spirit. And so, welcome to this worship service. And as we gather, wherever you are, we ask that you acknowledge in this moment to feel your feet on the ground and to acknowledge that most of us live and work on the unceded territories of the First Peoples. Here in the Fraser Valley, the Katzie, the Matsqui, the Semi-Amu, and the Kwantlen people, were the first peoples of this land, along with other nations. They traveled the rivers for trade. They cultivated the land. And so now we stand here. We have the blessing to work here, and we're called. We're called to reconcile what that relationship was as the shifting of the powers came to be, that the land became unceded to us. And so we walk in the spirit of reconciliation, the spirit of stewardship of the land together with the first peoples, that we might together enact a new way of being in relationship to each other and to the world. And I light the Christ candle as a way of acknowledging the spirit of life itself, bringing forth creation that was upon the waters and the air at the beginning of time, and continues to bring its wisdom, its light, and its love to the world.
Welcome to the Pulse Podcast. This is a live recording of how we do this. And when we first started thinking about the Shift Podcast, I kind of suggested that maybe at some point in the distant future, when we're comfortable with recording all of this, we could maybe add the video component. And here we are starting with the video component. So that's a bit of an adventure that I hadn't anticipated right off the hop. But COVID and live streaming have kind of given us new opportunities, new challenges, and we're here to jump into them. I'm really grateful to have our guest, Dr. and Reverend Richard Topping here. And you will hear me do a whole new introduction once we get to the actual conversation of the podcast. But I just wanted to say welcome and thank you for joining us in this little adventure that we've created. Mm-hmm. And we're excited to hear from you and your ideas. I think that's all. We're grateful that we have these opportunities here, and I just want to say I'm so grateful for the team that's around this, and all the people that have contributed their ideas and thoughts, and all of our guests. We have 3 episodes that are just nearing the end of completion, or we will after this, and we're going to release those monthly. So look for those, and we'll keep you posted. All right, are we ready? Okay, here we go. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Shift Podcast. I'm your host, Brad. Our topic today is imagination, and our guest is Dr. and Reverend Richard Topping. Welcome to the Shift Podcast, Richard.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. As you think about imagination and your journey and your exploration of it, is there a moment that stands out to you where it became important to you?
Yeah.
Something, a season or moment?
Yes. Yeah. Thanks. So I'm an educator for a living, mm-hmm. and when you see education take, that's always an imagination captured by what it's taught. So my son is a biologist, and I remember driving him out to Castlegar. He went to Selkirk College where he studied wildlife, and we drove out there in the car before he started, and we said, oh, look, there's mountains, there's some streams, we saw some animals. 3 years later, I go to pick him up, load up the car with a lot of stuff, and on the way back, it's a different world for him. Mm-hmm. He says, oh, Dad, look at that path in the woods, undulates like corridors. And I said, huh. And we drove on, and he said, oh, look, there's the ponderosa pine, and it has certain kinds of fascicles that are flame retardant. And then the flowers were blooming, and he said, oh, look, the angiosperms are blooming. And I thought, wow, this is a different world for him. And I kind of stood in awe of his professors, how they had educated him to see the same world he used to see, but in ways that were sort of life-giving and insightful. And I thought of myself as a theological educator, as somebody who educates leaders for the church. I wonder if we're educating people's imaginations with the kind of work we do so that they see the world differently and in more life-giving ways than when they had first arrived. Rather than just seeing one fact after another, they put them together in a kind of whole that is life-giving. C.S. Lewis talks about how the imagination is the faculty of meaning and reason is a faculty of truth. And here's what he means, that you can't make an assessment of whether or not something is life-giving until you put the pictures together. And so imagination functions to help us see things in a whole, in life-giving wholes, in ways that are solicitous and invite our participation, a kind of anticipation of a world that might be on the way. There's a passage in the Bible, maybe if I could read, sort of exemplifies this.
Yes.
This is from Isaiah chapter 11. And I think, here's a passage that really appeals to our imagination. It describes a world that's coming but that isn't here yet, to sort of unsettle people in the current arrangements, and it's all carrot and no stick here. The wolf shall lie down with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the kid, the calf and the lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the asp, and the weaned child shall put its hand on the adder's den. They will not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain, for the Lord will be full of for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. I mean, that's a delightful appeal to the imagination, to get people to lean into the kind of world that God is bringing, and to behave already as though that world is on the way. It's a vision of the peaceable kingdom that God brings. Interestingly, we know the phrase, where swords will be beat into plowshares, where justice and peace embrace, where lions and lambs lie down together. That's an attractive vision when you live in a world where lambs are a lion's lunch.
Right.
It's a striking alternative that is solicitous and invitational.
So as we look at the conditions of the world currently, our headlines are filled with news of turmoil and injustice and pain from natural disasters. It seems like all of those should be our priority. We should be giving those things our attention. And yet you are seeing imagination as such an important component of how we face these. And how is that for you?
Yeah, so, imagination is the basis for which we provide or are encouraged to look for solicitous options. We can complain and criticize about the way the world is, and we ought to do that. That's an important part of the prophetic, certainly in the Bible. But also part of the prophetic is to imagine something different than we've got. It may be one of the big opportunities for communities of faith where over against what maybe culture is providing, we nurture communities where people's imaginations are sanctified by what's going on in the context of worship, so that we imagine a kind of peaceable life together, where a kindness is routine, where forgiveness is normal. And that could be a kind of, it's slightly withdrawing for the world, but it's for the sake of the larger culture and context that we create forms of life that are gifts to the culture in which we live. If you want to see how that has worked in the past, certainly with somebody like Martin Luther King Jr. Here's a person who doesn't envision a new possible world by enforcing it. Again, with him, it's all carrot and no stick. This is a nonviolent movement from below in which the tropes and metaphors of the Bible are engaged to imagine a world where we are together, white and black, in a peaceable arrangement, where there's not winners and losers, but where we participate together. And he does that wonderful thing with mountains, the mountains of the
yes.
Bible, and then the mountains across the United States. And he gathers us up like John the Baptist to envision a world that God might bring that would be humane and peaceable and where there would be room for everyone.
Right. You've mentioned the Bible. To some, the Bible as authority might be a strange concept, and to others that might be a concept that they're actually actively recovering from.
Yes.
But I appreciate what you've brought here, and I love that phrase that you used, the solicitous options. That it's winsome, it's drawing us in, and there's an invitation there, and the invitation extends very broadly. I don't think we always get a real sense of how profound that invitation is for us, and how universal.
Yes.
So, as we think about this concept of authority in the Bible, how do you put those together?
Sure. I think, there's at least three ways in which we have read the Bible that have been more or less helpful. I was raised on a way of reading the Bible in which, you had a red pen and you were searching for the information statements. So, you would read, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." And you would say, well, why do we need all this poetry? Couldn't we just say God cares and be done with the long? That's what happens if
Right.
you're just searching for information. It's sort of like inviting people over for soup and boiling all the water off, taking the bit stuck to the pot and say, "Here, have some soup." Scholars call that the heresy of paraphrase.
Speaking
right?
of imagination, that is a great metaphor.
Yeah. So there's that fact-finding mission. Are there statements in the Bible that are historical and factual? Certainly. But is that the overriding concern of the Bible? Well, it's a longer story than that. The narrative is what carries it. So there's fact-finding, and so it's authoritative because you have facts there and they compel you to receive them. Or then there's the more moral trip, where you forget about the world that the Bible speaks of, and you just read the Bible for the kind of stainless steel imperatives. Do this, do that. And oftentimes those commandments, for example, with the 10 Commandments, we read them like they're universal rules that dropped out of the sky and forget the whole context of the commandments is Exodus 20, verse 1, "I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of slavery." The commandments are about how free people stay free, that God has liberated them for a new way of being together. They're not just universal moral rules. The context is the God who loves the world, the God who wants to guide us into freedom and into fullness of life. So you have to be careful with the kind of commanding and factual approaches to the Bible, which reduce it quite a bit. I think more and more now people are talking about the authority of the Bible to capture your imagination, that it tells stories, that it makes sense of the world in ways that are kind of compelling, that there's possible worlds that the Bible projects that aren't already, but that might be. If
That's
we're
right.
captured by the work of the Holy Spirit and empowered to live toward those worlds. And we do that as a community, not just as individuals.
I have a follow-up question for that
Yes.
that I want to ask later. But I think what you're teasing out here is really important for me to kind of shine a bigger spotlight on. We have viewed the Bible as this kind of rock-solid authority that rules. And yet in this passage that you just read, there's an invitation to invite. There's an invitation to imagine.
Yes.
And typically imagination is the realm of authority. Typically authority withholds the power or the value of imagination from people under authority.
Yes.
But this view of authoritativeness flips that, because the Bible itself contains the invitation to co-imagine with the
Yes.
Creator.
Yeah, this is a great point. It's part of what happens. I think it's part of one of the good things that happened in the Reformation is that the Bible becomes the property of all people. It democratizes issues of authority, and the Holy Spirit is our teacher, right? And you hear a word, and it captures a life, and it takes you in a direction, and very often it's an authority that comes from below that galvanizes a people around a vision, and that is simply marvelous where it rises up amongst God's people, or it rises up in culture in meaningful ways. I can remember last Lent, listening to Darker Still by Leonard Cohen.
Okay.
And there's a great line in one of his songs that captured my imagination during Lent. He said, "Jesus died to make men holy. We died to make things cheap." I mean, talk about reconfiguring your imagination. That's a gift from the culture, right?
Right.
That the sacrifices we make are often to keep the price of gasoline down. But you see that then there's this invitation to be a holy person that looks out not just for yourself, but for the world in which you live. So there's moments in culture that really have resonance with a kind of a God-given vision of the world, and to have your imagination sort of trained. And I think part of that is what we're trying to do in church, liturgically and reading the Bible, so that you could spot God's MO, God's modus operandi in the larger culture if you saw it.
Right.
And so you get these wonderful gifts like Leonard Cohen. The other person that's been helpful on this question is United Church minister, deceased of blessed memory, Northrop Frye, one of the great Canadian literary scholars. But he writes this little book, which is the Massey Lectures from 1963, and it's in like its 30th printing.
Okay.
Everybody reads this. But the title of the book was The Educated Imagination. And I can remember reading that, and it begins with a simple question. He says, "Why study literature?" And he says the answer is something like this. Well, because by studying literature, you're looking at how the world has been arranged at different times in human history, and that frees you up from believing that the way it is right now is necessary. It has to be this way. He says you become a dangerous person when you have an imaginative repertoire for the ways in which the world might be arranged, because to technical language, he says, it derealizes the current arrangement. And it makes me think of how many times that we could be more helpful to one another by not saying to people who have a kind of vision for a better world, "Oh, you have to be realistic." That usually means I lack imagination.
That's right.
I
Yeah.
can't countenance a new arrangement of things that could be that life-giving. And the nice thing is, this is another part on the issue of authority, is people might say, "Come on, you've got to be realistic. There's nothing that we can do about poverty in Calcutta."
Right.
And then this 4'11" Albanian woman just wades into it, Mother Teresa. Not only can you do things, people are doing things. And I think maybe in Protestantism we could appreciate the lives of the saints or Christian exemplars. You can't fight City Hall, then you get Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who stands up against the kind of Nazi regime because he's a follower of Christ. So there are wonderful exemplars out there that help us to imagine concretely, because they're living this out in real time and real space, like they're from somewhere else, like the future.
Right. So we've talked about the perspective of authority. There's also the perspective of obedience. And that's the other side of it.
Yeah.
And I like what you're teasing out in this, that obedience is also from the source of imagination.
Yes. Obedience is hard for us, postmoderns or modern people, because we authority always raises our suspicions, right? I mean, because whose authority and who is this good for and all of that. But there's something about imagination that really does play with the question of authority. The man that has been really helpful for me on this is a French philosopher and Christian, Reformed Christian man called Paul Ricoeur, again of blessed memory. But he wrote this wonderful essay where he talks about, really the authority of the Bible is not so much a command for the obedience of our will as it is an invitation to live in a possible world. That it sort of stokes your imagination and gives you a vision for a more humane arrangement that might come. And it's so solicitous, you don't feel like you're being pushed into it, you feel like you're being summoned into it. And with all the tensive elements that brings, when you're living for a world that is not yet, the difference between the world you live in now and the world you might live in, if you start leaning toward it, can be a bit of suffering. It can be a bit of being out of sorts with things. But it's not just for suffering's sake, it's for the sake of greater, say, love, greater inclusion, greater humanity that is just there on the horizon. And if you get a taste of that, I mean, the language of the New Testament is first fruits. Sometimes amongst God's people, you get just a taste of the world that might be, and it's enough to summon you toward even more of the world that could come.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. You've talked about the isolation of imagination sometimes. Sometimes you're out in front, and people aren't following that journey, and that can be a lonely place. Do you have advice for somebody who's in that place?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of that is, you know, much of our reading of the New Testament is confused because, no, because when we read things like you, we think that means me, individually. But so much of what the New Testament says when it says you, if we were to translate it properly into English, it'd be y'all.
Right.
Right? And there's a sense in which imagination is something cultivated in communities. By exemplars. And so there is a sense of finding fellowship, a communion of the saints even, through history has been very helpful. Other people have been here and struggled with similar things, and here's what they came up with. And it doesn't just call for sheer repetition, but it does call us to say, you know, they were faithful in their time, how do we be faithful in our own? And so you get that picture in the 11th chapter of the book of Hebrews that we're sort of being cheered on by people who have lived out the faith before.
Right.
The trick with Hebrews 11, of course, it talks about faith almost on analogy with imagination. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. That sounds a lot like imagination.
Sure
but then we
does.
go on to read the chapter, and instead of imitating the faith of the people in the chapter, we try and imitate what they did. And sometimes in church we think faithfulness is doing what the previous people did rather than being faithful in our time. That's repetition. That's not imagination or faithfulness. So groups of people together, imitating the faith of others, being inspired to do in our time the thing that's appropriate for our time rather than just repeating the past. And of course then the saints or exemplars, people who kick the feet out under, oh, that's not realistic. They're actually doing it. Not only is it realistic, it's happening.
It's happening. Yeah, exactly. And we have examples that we can point to. I appreciate that perspective. I really, I've lived in seasons where that sense of isolation has become its own thing for me. It becomes like that inner motivation. And at some point I catch myself and I realize, no, I have to bring it back to the imagination. I have to bring it back to what the core is, because that becomes its own, it has a life of its own that's actually not breeding health. But if it's working with the imagination, then you're in the flow and you can find people who resonate. And that's kind of an indicator in some ways. I mean, there are examples of people who just were on their own and they just did that. But there is that sense that imagination tends to work in community.
And there's the truncated imagination. Communities can also inhibit your imagination depending on the community. It reminds me of the story. You know, it's I hope a funny story, but a guy who goes duck hunting with a friend. And he shoots the duck falls, and he has a dog that runs across the water, gets the duck and brings it in the boat. Happens all day, and his friend doesn't say anything. And finally, at the end of the day, he says to his friend, "Did you notice anything special about my dog?" He says, "Yeah, he can't swim." You can see the point. That's the kind of truncated imagination that's not open to kind of wonder and delight and to, you know, when you have 12 file folders and something happens that won't fit into the 12, you get a new file folder. You don't try and jam it into one you already have. And so part of it is, you know, I mean, some kinds of spiritual disciplines, right? Prayer is where we open ourselves up. I mean, we pray crazy stuff like, you know, that God's rule might come. One of my favorite theologians, H. Richard Niebuhr, says, you know, standing in church and saying, and praying for God's rule, like thy kingdom come, he says, it's like standing in a mountain valley where the mountains are laden with snow and yelling. I mean, do you want this? So there's this sense of the invocation of God's movement in the world and the sanctification, the making holy of one's imagination, right? Imaginations are formed by your sense of possibility is formed by what goes into your life. I think in the time in which we live, people really understand that imaginations are shaped. For the longest time, people in the West tried to say, you know, a reasonable imagination is like this for everybody. And then you discover that imagination is kind of local, and it's stoked, it's fired up by the ideas that you share. So good reading, good worship, eyes open to the good world of God tends to form imagination for great things.
And again, that also opens us up to the fact that our imaginations are limited by our culture too.
Sure.
They're empowered by our culture, but
Yes.
when we start to look beyond, put the periscope up so we can look
Yes.
beyond what our immediate environs are,
Yes.
we start to see, oh, there are limits in our
Yes.
culture and our way of thinking,
Yes.
and we
Yes.
can start to embrace a
Yeah.
bigger, broader
Yes.
perspective in
It's
that.
like career day in high school, I remember. You had these little pamphlets you could look at for various careers, and everybody flips to the back to see how much money you make at it. And that's how you can see the imagination is kind of truncated in
Yes.
that view. And that took a lot of time. Catechesis, or the shaping and forming of people, is really well done these days by a capitalistic, militaristic, selfish, narcissistic culture. The point is, what are the other inputs going to be? And this, I think, is a huge opportunity for the church in the time in which we live, particularly where it comes to issues around sort of intercultural inputs. I'm thinking of the whole of the inputs of people who aren't like us into the corporate imagination is really important.
Yes. Yep, I agree. It looks like you're getting a new mic.
Oh, very good. Here we go. There we go. Thank you. Thank you. It's great that people want to hear me.
Yes, yes, we certainly do. Do you have advice for somebody who has an imagination? They have a pristine vision of what they want to accomplish, but making it real is really challenging. There's always a gap between the pristine view of what I can envision and maybe even what I expect, but then how that works together. And that can work at any level, from somebody who's trying to put paint marks on a canvas to somebody who's trying to coordinate a project with other people.
I mean, this is a big question. I mean, how do you cope with disappointment? How do you cope with, a vision of a reality that might come that seems so slow coming? I mean, I think of one of my favorite musicians, Bruce Cockburn. He says, how come history takes such a long, long time when you're waiting for a miracle, right?
Right.
And there's some of that. And so again, I think this is where the community is really quite helpful, in developing that group of associates, of friends. Even in the chapter that I mentioned in Hebrews, it talks about people who got the payoff, who believe and got the payoff, and then toward the end of the chapter, which we don't usually read at church, there's other people who died still hoping, right, who didn't get to see the fruit on the tree that they planted. And there's some sense in which, you have to be content with that, that in our time, can we move the ball forward a little and give a gift to those that follow us? I think in the corporate world, for all of its, struggles, they really have a sense of a succession plan, right? And so what's our plan as we think about the world that we yearn for? How do we hand on in good shape the goods that we have so that others have a better situation to work with and can carry the ball forward? The phrase social imaginary is really important. It's what's imagined together and over through time and in time. And of course, every year in the church we celebrate Advent to remind us we're still waiting for a world that's on the way. Right. I mean, the danger will be to settle too soon for too little if you're not careful, because the tensive elements of hoping for a new arrangement can defeat us at times. And that's where singing and certain kinds of meeting together with other groups, going to places where good things are breaking out, is really quite wonderful.
I appreciate one of the things that you've drawn forward in this, which is that sense of community and the development of a shared imagination. I want to speak to the people on the other side of that, the people who would be receptive to other people's imagination. How can we build that sensitivity in ourselves? How can we champion and encourage and empower imaginers in our midst?
Yeah, I think that's a real challenge in our time. And here's why I think it's a real challenge in our time, is that education in the time in which we live, we say, okay, when did we turn out a good graduate? And usually we say, well, we taught them to be a critical thinker, or a
Right.
suspicious person, right? So the hermeneutics of the interpretation which is suspicious of everything,
Yeah.
and it can take things apart. The difficulty with that is then we have generation after generation of people who can write book reports but never a book. You see what I mean? And so the signs of sophistication are to keep yourself safe from the input of other people's thinking. One of my favorite authors, a woman called Rita Felsky, English professor, she talks about how sometimes when we read, we roll out the barbed wire of criticism and suspicion. And she has this haunting line that won't leave me alone as the principal of a theological college. She says, how come we think we've got good graduates when they're hyper-articulate in their criticisms and tongue-tied about their loves? So, I mean, what I would say is, that contemplation and charitable reading, this is a principle in philosophy that I think is very important, that when there's two possible ways to understand somebody you're reading or conversing with, and one way is more favorable, always understand it in the most favorable light.
Right.
How do you become porous to good inputs is really important. How do you open your life to receive what you can't give yourself from another? And I think in the practice of prayer, that's why I think kneeling is good. I think prayer is the posture of dependence. It means we can't give ourselves what we most need, that we receive it from outside of ourselves. And I think practicing that posture, maybe bending one knee for people around us, if you know what I mean,
Yeah.
that we live interdependent lives. And we've done a great job as modern people hiding our dependencies. And we actually do need one another. And I think people like me who, maybe I'm an introvert, but one of the things we're discovering during COVID-19 is that I'm not this much of an introvert, right? And maybe it's made us hungry for human community in a good way, that we really do need each other. And we don't have all the ideas, we don't have all the willpower, we don't have all the affection. We need to drive a program forward and so this notion of being porous and charitable, to good sources, to taking them into your life, and to resisting our immediate suspicion about everything, which we think is a sign of sophistication, and very often just means that it leaves us lonely.
So that leads me into another perspective of imagination, the perspective of how we receive other people's inputs and how we determine what they mean is also a statement of imagination, or it's a process of imagination that we don't necessarily, we think we are intuitive. We think that we just get it. I was talking to one church leader who said, I like receiving things in black and white, meaning email, because then I know what somebody said. And I said, but then you eliminate 80% of the communication potential. And then it's all in your own imagination about how you're receiving other people's input, and that's a dangerous thing. But even where communication is clear and as rich as it can be, we still interpret. We're still constantly understanding other people's inputs through our own filters.
Yeah, sure. And I think you're touching on some really important things about how imagination is funded or stoked or encouraged or lit up, not just by the words other people speak, but by the example of the lives they live,
Right.
and the way
So
they
important.
engage us with their whole face, and the way that we matter because somebody really heard what we had to say. Even that excites people to move an idea forward. There's a tendency, of course, for people my age to speak to people who are younger and say, yeah, I thought that once too. Just wait until you get old and cynical like me, right?
Right.
Which is a mistake, I think. You hope that people never get over those delightful dreams for the way that the world might be. We're all hoping for different arrangements than we have right now. That's why people go to school, and that's why people study things. I've noticed at my school that people who want to do a PhD, even before they're done, they have imagination for what it's going to be like when they're done, and they already start wearing tweed with leather elbows on their jackets. They're anticipating the world that's on the way, and medical people wear stethoscopes before they're doctors.
That's
you
right.
see what I mean? So you're
Yeah.
all ready to dress like and inhabit the role that you want to be in. And I think sometimes maybe that's not a bad way to understand what church is doing. We're all being apprentices here to a world that's not here yet, but that is coming, where we'll be more at home than we are in this one. And we're trying to kind of gesture toward, not to neglect this world, but to kind of, gesture toward, incite greater energy for more humane arrangements.
I love that. I love that. I've talked to people who put aspiring in front of whatever they define themselves as. I'm an aspiring artist. And I say, knock that off. Just be it.
Yes.
Own that. There's no qualification that you need to, satisfy to call yourself an artist. And if you own that as your persona, you start to live into that reality, and you start to think that way.
Yes. My son, when he was about 5, he said something that made us all laugh. And I said, "Oh, when you grow up, are you going to be a comedian?" He said, "What's that?" I said, "That's somebody who makes people laugh." He said, "Then I'm already a comedian."
Bingo. Oh, such a good answer. The kids are so full of that kind of take you up short. Yes, I have a lot to learn from you. I love how you're drawing this imaginative perspective in how we interrelate. Can you touch on how we do that with history? How do we interpret history imaginatively?
Yeah, I mean, I'm inspired again and again by history, by characters in the past I study Reformation history and I study church history, and I hear people before us doing some things that are really helpful for the current moment in which we live. So Marguerite de Nevers is a woman who I really like. She is the King Francis I's sister, and she's watching the Reformation play out and listening to all these men argue. And she just says, "Oh my." And she starts to write theology in a whole different genre as conversations between people. And you think, thank you.
Yeah.
She calls them sort of pretentious debates, and she's arguing for theology as conversation. I think, we could use some of that. Or, for example...
And here we are.
Yeah, exactly, as in a conversation. Or take somebody like John Calvin. I know there are some good bits. So Calvin in Geneva establishes this meeting where all the clergy get together and have a meeting. Then the business is in the afternoon. But the morning is continuing education, where they listen to each other preach and try and help each other become better.
Wow.
In its wisdom, I belong to the Presbyterian Church. We knocked off the continuing education. We just have meetings. And you think, that there's something that could inspire our imagination. And now in our meetings, we bring in people who will talk about live issues of the day before we begin our business meetings. And it changes the tone of it. So if you're looking to history to kind of retrieve things, not to get too theological about it, but in the creed that we say in many churches, the Apostles' Creed, I think that's what we mean when we say, I believe in the communion of saints. It doesn't just mean we believe that the people here at the moment are helpful. It means there's this whole long thing that we can draw on. There's things you want to draw on as negative examples. Don't do that.
Right.
But there's so much that is really interesting for us to draw into our own time. People, again, I mentioned Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Is it possible to stand up against an evil regime? Apparently, it's costly, but apparently it is. And you get this whole group of the confessing church who said, who have a statement in which they reject. We have no Führer but Christ, they say. And you think, whoa, that's dangerous language. But they imagined a world that was different than the world that was being served up in the moment. I think that's delightful and inspiring when you look at that. Or, Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Wow. Here's a guy who's in St. George's Cathedral after they have shut down a meeting, and he's in the cathedral preaching after they've been told not to be there, and the soldiers line the walls all the way around the cathedral and ready to shut down the service. And he says, you guys might be strong, but you're not God. And it gets very tense, and then he steps out from behind the pulpit and says, so why don't you come over and join the winning side? And you think, wow, that's like sanctified imagination. I wouldn't have thought of that.
Yeah, right.
And that's deeply instructive to the rest of us. Or somebody like Mother Teresa, who's on a flight to Mexico City from somewhere in Europe. And when it comes time to feed the passengers, she said, well, could you just give me the lunch, and I'll give it to the people I'm working with, to the poor in Mexico City. And they said, well, okay, but just sit down, would you? So she sits down. And then she stands up again and says to people in the plane, you folks all look well fed. Maybe you could all give your lunches to the kids I'm going to work with in Mexico City. And finally, people sign on with it. And then the plane lands, and she says, how am I going to get all these lunches to my kids? And the people on the plane said, well, I don't know, you got to get off. She said, I'm not leaving the plane until you get me a truck to carry all these lunches. And so finally they said, listen, we'll get you the truck if you just get off the plane. And the guy who was talking about this, he says it changed his life. He became involved in Afghanistan and Iraq, delivering relief in both of those places. And they said, well, how did this influence your life? He says, Mother Teresa, she's just such a bloody pain in the neck. But talk about stoking imagination.
Yes.
Those are embodied examples of how you can make a difference by being imaginative about possibilities you thought were truncated, but are actually wider than you had thought. And a lot of that has to do with how your heart and your affection is moved and how you love people and care enough about them to endure a bit of awkwardness for the sake of greater life for others. I mean,
Right.
that's pretty rooted in the Christian message.
So there's that element that a consecrated imagination, an imagination that is integrated with our core values, gives us courage. That's where we can
Yeah, yeah.
draw on that, and we can be a bloody pain in the neck.
Yeah.
But hopefully in a winsome,
Yeah.
giving people solicitous options, right?
Yes.
And looking for how we can make the biggest, best difference, and all of that is so. It's so in us to be imaginative.
I think imagination helps us to be more than critical. It helps us to be constructive and creative.
Yes,
It helps us
that's a
to
great word.
draw people in by allure of the beauty of the thing, right? I mean, beauty is, it's really tough to stand in front of a picture and convince somebody it's beautiful, right? I mean, you can do a little bit of that with art education, but there is the thing that summons. I tell people sometimes that my role as a theologian, teaching people theology about God, is sort of like the tour guide on the Maid of the Mist, that boat that goes by Niagara Falls. So you get on the boat and you say, okay, Niagara Falls the falls used to be here, but through erosion, and there's this much water in terms of gallons coming up, and here's the people who went over in a barrel. But the closer you get to the falls, the less you matter, because the thing thunders out your description. And I think that's what it is with imagination. You gesture and the attempts to present the vision, but then the vision captures people and takes them in a way that isn't compelling, isn't offensive. It just summons you in because of its sheer beauty and magnitude. And so much of the Gospels are about that, right? About this kind of wordless response to the goodness of some event that Jesus produces to make people's lives better. And it drives people to talk, but it's almost disoriented talk. They're
Yes.
wowed by it,
Yes.
right?
You brought it up, so I want you to define beauty for us. How would you unpack that? There's so many different shades and angles, and I think our understanding of beauty in our particular culture in our day is, as you would say, truncated. It's simplified, and I think you have a bigger, richer idea of what beauty is.
Yeah, see, I'd want to talk about beauty theologically. How is it related to the beauty of God? And that takes some doing, because lots of people have presented with views of God that aren't beautiful at all,
Right.
that are punitive and life diminishing rather than life enhancing. The beauty of God is not just any beauty. It's the beauty of God's coming alongside of a world that God loves. It's the beauty of God choosing not to be God without us. We don't have a God who isn't a God who's always already in relationship, who creates people in God's own image to be together and to experience this great gift called life. So for me, beauty is very centered in the theology helps me with that. But it doesn't help me just to be a kind of sectarian. I only recognize it amongst church people or something.
Right.
It's sort of like you're trained to recognize the beautiful here, so that in this big, wide world where beauty occurs in so many places, you think, oh, God's in that. Look at the beauty of that thing. Or being in church camp, I remember going on a hike, and we came out on this big cliff, and this 13-year-old looks out on this view that they had, and they said, oh, the heavens declare the glory of God. I mean, that took a lot of training to get people to see and to ascribe that to the giver of life. I think I would say that I mean, this is a heavy word, but where beauty is concerned, I would say that sometimes the human problem is that we're doxologically challenged.
Okay.
Is that
Yep, I'm
because
gonna
we
get you to
have
unpack that.
doxology means to
Yep.
praise. That when we see the beautiful, we get afraid of it, or we want to own it or something.
Right.
And so rather than just say, hey, that's great, we almost envy the Creator, or we envy one another. And we have to be liberated from that desire to kind of just see the sheer delight of it. And I think beauty, a definition you can get you in the neighborhood, but beauty just gets you.
Yeah,
Right?
right.
You know when you've come across the beautiful, because from then on, you're in a different context. You thought you had a context within which to understand beauty. Beauty presents itself. Now you see all of life in terms of what presented itself to you. Now the beautiful is in relationship, or beauty is in relationship to the beautiful. That's very much a kind of Christian notion that beauty is a kind of staircase to God. We behold what's beautiful, and it makes us want to anticipate the beautiful.
Right.
Right?
And so you're drawing a picture that beauty is far beyond just aesthetics. It's far beyond just kind of how we appreciate something for the good that it makes us feel potentially.
Yes, yes.
And I'm thinking of pictures that I've seen, photographs, paintings, that are pretty ugly.
Yes,
but the
yes.
content of truth
Yes,
and
yes.
what's contained is
Yes,
actually beautiful.
Yeah,
The intent.
I think that's a good point. That the beautiful is not. It tells something that we need to hear. There's a famous picture, if I could describe, by a guy called Harrison, and it depicts the crucifixion at the time of apartheid in South Africa, and it reconfigures all the people, and the soldier with the spear is the prime minister of South Africa. The person on the cross is Lutuli, who is the head of the ANC. That's a reconfiguration of how you understand what's going on here. Is it beautiful? It's beautiful in the sense that it's truth-telling, it's revelatory. It helps you to understand where in the world you are so you could move from that point. But it's a description of a situation that is kind of converted by the picture into helping a real seeing of maybe things that are powerful and invite a change in us.
So, as we think and reflect on this whole subject of imagination and how we're inspired and how we reflect on that, do you have one final word of advice for our listeners as they're processing their lives and trying to make imagination more real for them?
Yeah. Look to the margins, right? There's a wonderful woman writer. Her name is Serene Jones. She's actually the president of Union Theological Seminary. She has a wonderful essay called Imagining Scripture and Dreaming Bible. And she talks about her commitments to liberation theology, to feminism. And then people say, where did that come from? And she says, from the story of Zacchaeus. And you think, what? She said, no, it's the story of Zacchaeus. I've been reading this since I was a little girl. And what I get from that story of Zacchaeus is that Jesus always has his peripheral vision at work. He sees things that most people miss. And she says, because of the story of Zacchaeus, this little weasel up a tree who nobody really wants to bother with, he kind of oils through town, and he's in cahoots with the enemy and all that. But Jesus somehow sees something there that the rest of us don't see. And so she says, reading the Bible, and then in Luke's gospel, Jesus always does his best work on the way into town or leaving town, never in town. It's kind of, it's like a teacher who said, these kids used to always interrupt me until I recognized my work is the interruptions. And it's sort of like on the way into town. In the ancient world, that's where the garbage dump actually was, on the edge of town. It's where all the lost causes were. People with leprosy, broken pottery, in our day, old tires. And Jesus spends a lot of time on the edge of town, rehabilitating, retrieving a world that everybody else has given up on. And I found the greatest inputs have been there for me. I mean, the other day I was listening to James Forbes, African-American pastor of Riverside Church, and somebody says to Forbes, hey, you've been in both predominantly white, predominantly black church. What's the difference? And he says this: in predominantly white churches, you think God needs you. In predominantly black churches, they know they need God. And I was like, thank you. Now I've got to reimagine. But there's a word, that comes from outside my world to rethink how, my need for autonomy, my need to be highly individuated, my need to fix every problem, rather than to receive as a gift. It's a strange thing about insight, is that in a world that thinks knowledge is an heroic intellectual achievement, very often the greatest insights come as almost sheer gift. And I think, so to be aware of the margins, the word that comes from outside, the unexpected word, and that takes some disciplines, the ability to linger, the willingness to relent, to stick with something and to change one's mind, not to be proud. I've always thought, and you think, wow, never changing your mind. What's the difference between that and being, I don't know, dead? So there's a sense in which imagination really is stoked by the kind of marginal word, the word from outside. People who come into your lives who you haven't had before in your life. I was listening to a sermon on Thursday from our chapel at VST at home, online, with the window open. I didn't realize, but at the end of the sermon, my neighbor who's sitting out at the table in front of her house heard the whole thing. She says, "Amen." and then we had a great talk about what preaching is. I mean, she's not a church person, but she had some really insightful things that I never would have heard because I sort of stick in the holy huddle too much. And this kind of word that comes from somebody who's a friend has a lot to say. So keep your eyes to the margins. That's what I've learned from Serene Jones.
Serene Jones. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for sharing all of this with us.
My pleasure.
This is an inspiring topic, and I think it's such an encouragement for our journey, and particularly for us on the Shift podcast team, to interact with you on this and to have our own imaginations enhanced by your words. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And thanks for being part of this experiment here in the live stream production of this. We are excited about being able to share this with you in its actual audio form soon. So, thank you.
Wow. Imagining a world, being inspired to go to the margins, to open up our peripheral vision. What an amazing way that United Churches of Langley has decided as a congregation to fund the possibility, to fund an imagining that came forth. And so I wanted to share these final words around that we'll be sharing as part of the opening of every podcast as it gets launched next month. Connection requires a posture of listening that extends past our boundaries and into our beings, shifting from these self-same boundaries and perhaps even our dogmas in the process. And that is what this Shift podcast is all about. To connect us with what's moving and what's growing, to engage it with hospitality, and to invite it to change who we are. Welcome to Shift. And so this is our ministry of United Churches of Langley, an invitation for all of us to change, to open up to the imaginings of ourselves, of each other, and of the Spirit itself in us and with us. And so your generous donations to United Churches of Langley mission and ministry go to support all of these. The congregation, as part of its annual meeting, voted to fund this Shift podcast ministry. And so your continuous giving allows for us to continue to do the good ministry, to be part of the imaginings of people of all ages, and to bring forth those new imaginings into form and into creation. And so I give great thanks to you for all the many ways that you show your generosity in time and talents. And there's many ways, as you know, to give through GivePoint, which the link is there on your screen, as well as by sending an e-transfer to transfers@ucol.ca. Or you can pop by a check and put it in the mailbox here at the Murrayville location. However you choose to give, it's just such a blessing to have all of you in support of the ministry that we do here through United Churches of Langley and reaching out to the imaginings of a new world with all of us. So as we go out to imagine a new world and enact it, let us pray. O Spirit of life, O inspiration of all creation, you whispered your words upon the winds of time. You enact change and blow through us and through all creation your beauty, your bounty, your truth, your wholeness. Through this prayer, we open up to your great imaginings that we might attune ourselves to the Spirit that is always on the move, always creating, always alluring us to a greater possibility to enact and to call forth a vision of heaven on earth, of world where people are not disenfranchised, where people are included, the people on the margins are drawn in so that the borders and boundaries get released and we come together as one people of an earth that is committed to peace, harmony, joy, love. Be with us on this journey. Be that alluring presence that calls us into something that we have yet to imagine. Help us to remember, as Paul wrote to the Ephesians so many years ago, that there is a power at work within us that is far greater than we can ever ask and imagine. Help us to know this. Help us to lean into this truth that we might become instruments of your peace, instruments of your love, instruments of the joy and wholeness that is possible in a global community committed to enacting these qualities through us, as us, and between us. Bring us to your holy level that allows for us to see from the mountaintops what is possible, a new vision, a new life, a new world. And help us to be this, to be that Mother Teresa that stands forth and continuously demands the imaginings of a world that feeds others, that gives fully of itself to each other. May this be the possibility that we lean into, and may we be open to your new imaginings revealed to us in prayer, in meditation, in worship, and in conversation. We thank you for the inspiration and imaginations of life itself. Amen.
awake in the morn from beautiful dreams. Let beauty awake from rest. Let beauty awake for beauty's sake. In the hour when the birds awake in the break and the stars are yet bright in the west. Let beauty awake from rest. Let beauty awake in the eve from the slumber of day. Awake in the crimson eve, in the day's dusk end, when the shades ascend. Let her wake to the kiss of a tender friend, to render again and receive. Let beauty awake in the eve, while we, the gardeners of creation blessed, furrow the soil at our Savior's behest, and bury the seeds of our own life's death, and suffer God's glory to grow. Yes, we, the priests of all that is made, gather the greatness of creation's praise, that burgeoning freshness of glory displayed from the depths of the earth below. Let beauty awake in the morn from the cool of the grave. Let beauty awake from death. Let beauty awake for Jesus' sake, in the hour when the angels their silence break, and the garden is bright with his breath. Let beauty awake from